Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into something that should have every dog owner out there listening very carefully. Canine distemper.
A very important topic, and actually one that hits very close to home for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, early in my career, before I specialized, I saw a truly heartbreaking case of distemper in a young puppy.
I can only imagine. It's a disease that can really devastate families and, of course, the dogs themselves.
Absolutely. And, back then I didn't have the experience or the knowledge I have now, but that case stuck with me. It really highlighted the severity of this disease, and it's a big reason why I'm so passionate about educating people about it.
Well, we're very lucky to have you here today to share your expertise. And to help us with that, we have some excellent resources to draw from.
Yeah, these are really great materials.
We have a study from Barra, Bahia, Brazil, that gives us a real on-the-ground look at how distemper presents in dogs, how it's treated, and the outcomes for those dogs.
Yeah, that local perspective is really valuable.
And then, to give us a wider view, we also have several comprehensive literature reviews that cover, well, pretty much everything you need to know about canine distemper, from the virus itself to transmission, the pathology, diagnosis, and the strategies for prevention and treatment.
Having that range of information is so important for getting a full picture of the disease.
Exactly. So let's start, I guess, at the beginning. The canine distemper virus itself, what exactly are we dealing with here?
So canine distemper is caused by, as you said, the canine distemper virus, or CDV. And what's really interesting is that it belongs to a group of viruses called morbilliviruses. You might be more familiar with some of its relatives, like the measles virus in humans and the rinderpest virus in cattle.
Oh, wow. I never knew distemper was related to measles.
It is. They're all part of the same family, and they share some similarities in how they behave and the kind of damage they can do.
So tell us a bit more about this virus. It's an RNA virus, right?
Right, it is. Basically, that means its genetic material is made of RNA instead of DNA.
Yeah.
And that RNA carries the blueprint, the instructions, for the virus to replicate itself. And importantly, for, vaccine development, all that, we need to understand this RNA structure.
And there are some specific proteins on the virus that are really important for how it infects cells, right?
Exactly. There are two key proteins, what we call structural proteins, that are essential for the virus to get into a cell and start causing trouble.
Okay, and what are those?
They're called hemagglutinin, or H protein, and fusion protein, or F protein.
Hemagglutinin and fusion. So what do they do?
Well, think of the H protein as the key. It's what allows the virus to attach to a healthy cell. It basically recognizes and binds to specific receptors on the surface of the cell, and then the fusion protein, that's the muscle. Once the virus is attached, the F protein helps the virus's outer layer, its membrane, to fuse with the cell membrane. That lets the virus sneak its genetic material inside.
It's like a two-step process.
Ah.
Attach and then merge.
Exactly. And once that viral RNA is inside the cell, well, that's when things really start to go wrong. The virus hijacks the cell's machinery and uses it to make more copies of itself.
And these copies then go on to infect other cells, and the cycle continues.
You got it. And importantly, particularly the H protein, that's the one that undergoes a lot of changes, a lot of variations. That's why it's so challenging to develop a vaccine that's effective against all strains of the virus.
So the virus is constantly evolving, trying to stay one step ahead.
You could say that, yeah. Now, once those new virus particles are released, they can then go on to infect other cells in the body. And this is where we start to see the really serious effects of distemper.
Okay, so the virus is in. Where does it tend to go in the dog's body?
Well, the virus is pretty versatile. It can replicate in a lot of different cell types, but it seems to have a particular preference for cells involved in the immune system, specifically lymphoid cells, which are crucial for mounting an immune response.
So the virus attacks the very system that's supposed to be fighting it off.
It does. And that's a huge problem. And another type of cell that's very susceptible to CDV is macrophages. These are like the cleanup crew of the immune system. They engulf and destroy foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses.
So the virus is basically weakening the dog's defenses from the inside out.
Exactly. By targeting these key immune cells, the virus cripples the dog's ability to fight back. And this widespread replication in the lymphoid tissues, well, that leads to something called immunosuppression. The dog's immune system becomes compromised, making them much more vulnerable to other infections.
Secondary infections, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be. These secondary infections can often be just as serious, if not more so, than the distemper infection itself. They can lead to all sorts of complications, and they make treatment much more difficult.
It's really a double whammy for the dog's body. So Let's talk about how this virus actually gets around. How is it transmitted from one dog to another?
Well, the primary mode of transmission is through aerosols and droplets. Basically, when an infected dog coughs, sneezes, or even barks, they release tiny particles of saliva and respiratory secretions into the air.
And these particles can carry the virus.
They do. And if another dog inhales those particles, they can become infected. The virus can also be spread through direct contact with the bodily fluids of an infected dog. Like if a healthy dog comes into contact with urine, feces, or even the discharge from the eyes or nose of an infected dog.
So sharing food and water bowls, playing with contaminated toys, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that even if an infected dog isn't showing any obvious symptoms, they can still shed the virus and infect other
Oh,
dogs.
wow. So even seemingly healthy dogs can be carriers. That's a concern. And what about the environment? How long can the virus survive outside of a host?
Well, that's one bit of good news in all of this. Compared to some other viruses, CDV is actually pretty fragile in the environment. It doesn't survive for very long once it's out in the open.
So it's not like it can linger on surfaces for days or weeks.
No, not really. It's easily destroyed by drying, sunlight, and common disinfectants. Simple things like household cleaners that contain things like, formal phenol or quaternary ammonium compounds, those can be effective in killing the virus.
That's reassuring. So basic hygiene can really make a difference.
Absolutely. Regular cleaning of kennels, food and water bowls, toys, and any other surfaces that dogs might come into contact with that can go a long way in preventing the spread of the virus.
Good advice for all dog owners. Now, when we talk about who's most at risk for getting distemper, puppies often come to mind.
Yeah, puppies are definitely a high-risk group. And there's a reason for that. You see, when puppies are born, they get some protection from their mother's antibodies, which are passed on through the placenta and in the mother's milk. These maternal antibodies provide passive immunity.
So they're borrowing their mother's immune system for a while.
Exactly. But the problem is that those maternal antibodies start to decline as the puppy gets older. And somewhere between 3 and 6 months of age, there's this window of vulnerability.
It's like a gap in their defenses.
You could say that. The maternal antibodies have waned, but the puppy's own immune system hasn't fully matured yet, and they haven't completed their vaccination series to build up their own active immunity. So during this time, they're much more susceptible to infections like distemper.
So those early puppy vaccinations are absolutely crucial.
They are, and it's really important for owners to understand that unvaccinated dogs of any age are at risk. It's not just puppies.
So even an older dog that's never been vaccinated could get distemper.
Absolutely. Age doesn't make them immune. And what's even more concerning is that even vaccinated dogs can still get distemper.
Wait, what? I thought vaccines were supposed to protect them.
They do offer excellent protection, but, sometimes vaccine failures happen. It's not a perfect system.
So why would a vaccine not work?
Well, there are a few reasons. One is that the virus itself is constantly changing, like we talked about earlier. So the strain of the virus circulating in a particular area might not be a perfect match for the strain used in the vaccine.
So it's like trying to hit a moving target.
It is. And then there are individual factors in the dog itself. Things like their genetics, their overall health, their age, and even their stress levels can influence how well their immune system responds to a vaccine.
So some dogs might just not mount a strong enough immune response even with the vaccine.
Exactly. And then there are also factors related to the vaccine itself, like if it wasn't stored properly, if it wasn't administered correctly, or if the vaccination schedule wasn't followed, those things can also reduce its effectiveness.
So it's not always a guarantee.
It's not. And that's why it's so important to talk to your vet about your dog's individual risk factors and make sure they're getting the appropriate vaccinations.
Good advice. And did the study in Bar give us any insights into how those dogs were being exposed to the virus?
It did. And one of the key findings was that a large majority of the infected dogs were actually domiciled.
Domiciled, meaning they lived in homes?
Yes, they were mostly household pets. In fact, almost 76% of them were living in homes. And the majority of those dogs, something like 67%, had contact with other dogs or with stray animals.
Oh, so even if your dog mainly stays indoors, there's still a risk if they interact with other dogs.
There is. Those seemingly harmless encounters at the park, at doggy daycare, or even just on walks, those can potentially expose your dog to the virus.
That's something for every dog owner to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about the disease itself. What happens when a dog actually gets infected with distemper? What are the signs?
Well, one of the biggest challenges with distemper is that the clinical signs can be incredibly varied. That's one reason it can be so tricky to diagnose. It affects multiple systems in the body: respiratory, gastrointestinal, and, most concerningly, the nervous system.
So it's not just a simple cough or a fever.
Not at all. It can manifest in so many different ways. And that's why it's often called the great imitator. It can look like a lot of other diseases, which can delay diagnosis and make treatment more difficult.
What are some of the early signs that an owner might notice?
Well, early on, you might see things like fever, lethargy, loss of appetite, and often you'll see a thick, mucopurulent discharge from the eyes and nose.
Mucopurulent, meaning?
Meaning it contains mucus and pus. It's often yellowish or greenish in color. And you might also see some gastrointestinal signs, like vomiting and diarrhea.
So pretty general signs of illness, but then it can progress to more serious problems.
It can. And one of the most devastating aspects of distemper is its impact on the nervous system. Neurological signs are very common in distemper, and they can range from mild to severe.
And what kind of neurological signs are we talking about?
Oh, a wide range. You might see things like incoordination, stumbling, weakness in the limbs, and as the disease progresses, you might see seizures, paralysis, muscle tremors, head tilt, even a stiff neck.
And these neurological problems, they can develop during the initial illness, or can they show up later?
They can actually occur at any stage of the disease. Sometimes they're the first sign that something's wrong, but, and this is really scary for owners, sometimes they don't show up until after the dog seems to have recovered from the initial illness, weeks or even months later.
Wow, that's really concerning. And the Barra study, they documented some of these specific signs, didn't they?
They did. It really highlights the variety of ways that distemper can affect dogs. They found that ophthalmic signs, those related to the eyes, were present in almost 64% of the cases, and nervous signs were seen in over 57%. And they also saw a significant number of cases with integumentary signs,
Integumentary.
meaning skin problems,
Yeah.
things like rashes, pustules, and hyperkeratosis.
Hyperkeratosis, what's that?
That's when the skin, especially on the nose and paw pads, becomes thickened and hardened. It's sometimes called hard pad disease. And they also saw digestive signs, respiratory signs, and of course, those non-specific signs we talked about earlier, like fever, lethargy, anorexia, and dehydration. What's really striking is that the dogs in the study presented with anywhere from 3 to 14 different symptoms.
14. That's incredible. And really shows how unpredictable this disease can be. So with such a range of possible signs, how do you even begin to diagnose distemper?
It's a challenge for sure. Diagnosis often involves piecing together a lot of information. It starts with a thorough physical exam, looking for any of those characteristic signs we've been talking about.
So looking in their eyes, checking their reflexes, feeling their lymph nodes, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And getting a detailed history from the owner is crucial. Things like vaccination status, recent travel, exposure to other dogs, any previous illnesses, all of that is important.
So it's like detective work,
Yeah.
putting all the clues together.
It is. And then lab tests can play a vital role in confirming the diagnosis.
What kind of lab tests are we talking about?
Well, in the past, finding something called viral inclusion bodies in certain tissues, that was a common way to diagnose distemper. These are basically microscopic structures that are formed when the virus replicates inside cells. But the problem is that even if you don't find inclusion bodies, it doesn't necessarily rule out distemper.
So it's not a foolproof method.
No. But nowadays, we have more sensitive and specific tests, like PCR, that can detect the virus's genetic material directly.
PCR, that's the polymerase chain reaction test, right?
That's it. It's a very powerful tool. We can use PCR to look for the virus's RNA in samples like blood, urine, cerebrospinal fluid, even tissue biopsies.
In the Barra study, they use PCR, right?
Well, they mentioned that one of the challenges they faced was the lack of routine laboratory confirmation. They didn't always have access to tests like PCR.
Oh, so even though it's a valuable tool, it's not always readily available everywhere.
That's right. And it's worth mentioning that even PCR isn't perfect. Sometimes you can get false negative results, especially early in the course of the disease when the viral load is low.
So there's no single test that's a 100% accurate all the time.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for vets to use their clinical judgment and consider all the available information when making a diagnosis. Now, there are also serological tests, which look for antibodies to the virus in the dog's blood.
Antibodies, those are the proteins the immune system produces to fight off the virus, right?
Right. But serology can be tricky with distemper. Sometimes dogs that are very sick and die from distemper, they might not have detectable antibody levels. And on the flip side, high antibody levels could be from a previous infection or from vaccination, so it doesn't necessarily mean the dog is currently infected.
So you have to interpret those antibody tests carefully.
You do. So it's really a combination of clinical signs, history, and lab tests that helps us arrive at a diagnosis.
Okay, so let's say a dog is diagnosed with distemper. What are the treatment options? Is there a cure?
Unfortunately, there is no cure for canine distemper. There's no magic bullet, no antiviral drug that can eliminate the virus from the body.
So what can be done?
Treatment focuses on providing supportive care to help the dog manage the symptoms, fight off secondary infections, and hopefully give their immune system a chance to recover.
What does that supportive care involve?
Well, it depends on the individual dog and how severely they're affected, but it often includes things like broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent or treat secondary bacterial infections, fluid therapy to combat dehydration, nutritional support to ensure they're getting the nutrients they need, and medications to control seizures, reduce inflammation, and manage pain.
It sounds like a very intensive approach.
It can be, and it requires a lot of dedication from the owner and close monitoring by the vet. And even with the best supportive care, the prognosis for distemper can be guarded, meaning the chances of recovery are uncertain. It depends on a lot of factors like the dog's age, their overall health, how severe the infection is, and how quickly treatment is started.
Did the Bora study give us any information about the treatments they used and how effective they were?
It did. They found that the most commonly prescribed treatments were multivitamins given to almost 70% of the dogs and antimicrobials used in about 64% of the cases. And that's pretty typical of the supportive approach.
And did they see a link between treatment and outcome?
They did. They found a statistically significant association between completing the prescribed treatment and recovery. So dogs that finished their full course of treatment were more likely to recover. But they also noted that there was a high rate of non-compliance with treatment.
Meaning owners weren't giving their dogs the full course of medication.
Yeah. And they speculated that this could be due to a number of factors, like the guarded prognosis, financial constraints, and the difficulty of administering multiple medications to a sick dog. They also found that dogs that had follow-up veterinary visits were much more likely to complete their treatment and recover, so that ongoing veterinary care and owner commitment are really crucial.
It really highlights the importance of that partnership between the vet and the owner.
Absolutely. Now, the BARA study also found something quite interesting. They found that a significant number of owners had given their dogs medications prior to seeking veterinary care.
So they were trying to treat their dogs at home before taking them to the vet.
Exactly. They were giving them things like antibiotics and anti-inflammatories without a proper diagnosis. And while it's understandable that owners want to help their sick pets, this can actually mask the true signs of the disease and make it harder for the vet to make an accurate diagnosis.
So it could delay treatment and potentially worsen the outcome.
It could. And the study specifically cautioned against the use of corticosteroids, a type of anti-inflammatory, before a proper diagnosis is made. Because while corticosteroids can be helpful in some cases, they can also have negative effects and might not be the appropriate treatment for distemper.
So the takeaway there is, if your dog is sick, don't try to play doctor at home. Get them to a vet as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Early diagnosis and treatment are key to giving your dog the best possible chance of recovery. Now, given how serious and difficult to treat distemper can be, prevention is really the best medicine.
And prevention mainly comes down to vaccination, right?
It does. Vaccination is the most effective way to protect your dog from distemper. In fact, in healthy dogs that receive all the recommended doses of a properly stored and administered vaccine, it's considered to be almost 100% protective.
Almost 100%. That's pretty good odds. So what's the typical vaccination schedule for puppies?
Well, it can vary slightly depending on the specific vaccine and your veterinarian's recommendations, but generally speaking, puppies start their distemper vaccination series somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks of age.
And they get a series of shots.
Right, they get booster shots every 3 to 4 weeks until they're at least 16 weeks old.
And why 16 weeks?
Remember those maternal antibodies we talked about earlier? Well, those antibodies can actually interfere with the vaccine's effectiveness, so we wait until most of those maternal antibodies have declined before giving the final booster shot. And sometimes an additional booster is recommended around 6 to 12 months of age, and then after that, typically every 1 to 3 years, depending on the specific vaccine and the dog's risk factors.
So those early puppy vaccinations are absolutely vital. But we talked earlier about vaccine failures. Can you go into a little more detail about why those happen?
Sure. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes it's because of the virus itself. The canine distemper virus, it's a master of disguise. It can change its appearance, mutate, to try and evade the immune system. So a vaccine developed based on an older strain of the virus might not be as effective against a newer mutated strain.
So it's an ongoing arms race between the virus and the vaccines.
In a way, yes. And then, as we also discussed, there are individual factors in the dog that can play a role. Some dogs might just have a weaker immune response to vaccines, maybe due to their genetics or underlying health conditions.
So it's not always the vaccine's fault.
No, not necessarily. And then there are also things like improper storage or handling of the vaccine. If the vaccine isn't kept at the right temperature or if it's administered incorrectly, that can also reduce its effectiveness.
So it's a complex issue with lots of variables. And the BARA study, they had some pretty interesting data about vaccination, right?
They did. It really highlights the importance of vaccination. They found that only a very small percentage of the dogs that tested positive for distemper, only about 15%, had been adequately vaccinated.
Adequately meaning they had received the full recommended series of shots.
Yes, and at the appropriate times. So that really emphasizes the need for better vaccination practices, both in terms of coverage and adherence to the recommended schedules.
Definitely a message for all dog owners out there. Now let's talk about outcomes. What's the prognosis for a dog diagnosed with distemper?
Sadly, the prognosis for canine distemper can be quite poor. The mortality rate, that's the percentage of dogs that die from the disease, it's estimated to be somewhere between 60 and 70%.
So the majority of dogs that get distemper don't survive.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. And even for those that do survive, they often suffer long-term consequences.
Like what?
Well, we talked about the neurological problems that can occur. Things like seizures, paralysis, muscle tremors, those can become permanent. And some dogs develop chronic respiratory problems or gastrointestinal issues. And some dogs, they even experience changes in their behavior or temperament after recovering from distemper.
It's a really tough disease. And what did the BARA study find about outcomes?
Their data was a bit limited in terms of long-term follow-up, but among the cases where they did have outcome information, mortality was higher than recovery, and they noted that a significant number of cases were lost to follow-up.
Meaning they didn't know what ultimately happened to those dogs.
Right, and they pointed out that the low rate of return visits for follow-up care could have negatively impacted treatment success.
So again, that emphasizes the importance of that continued relationship with your veterinarian.
Absolutely. Now, one final question that often comes up is whether canine distemper poses any risk to human health. Can people catch it from their dogs?
That's a good question, especially since we talked about how it's related to measles.
Right. Well, the good news is that canine distemper is not considered a direct threat to human health. There's no definitive evidence that people can be naturally infected with CDV.
So we can't catch it from our dogs.
Not through natural exposure, no. However, there have been some reports of experimental infections in humans, but those were done in a lab setting.
Experimental meaning they intentionally exposed people to the virus.
Right, in a very controlled environment. And in those cases, the people didn't develop any symptoms.
So it seems like our immune systems are pretty good at fighting it off.
They seem to be. However, there is some ongoing research looking into a possible link between CDV and certain human neuroendocrine diseases.
Neuroendocrine diseases, those are.
Diseases that involve both the nervous system and the endocrine system, the system that produces hormones.
And what kind of diseases are we talking about?
Well, some researchers have suggested a possible link between CDV and multiple sclerosis, a chronic neurological disease that affects the central nervous system. And there's also some interest in a possible connection between CDV and a rare complication of measles called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, or SSPE,
That's
a progressive brain disease that can occur years after a measles infection. It's very rare, but it's very serious.
So while we can't directly catch distemper from our dogs, there might be some indirect connections that are still being investigated.
That's the current thinking. But it's important to emphasize that this is still an area of active research, and more studies are needed to fully understand any potential links between CDV and human health.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and, honestly, a little bit scary deep dive into canine distemper. It's clearly a very complex and serious disease. So let's recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Absolutely. First and foremost, canine distemper is highly contagious and can be fatal, especially in puppies and unvaccinated dogs.
And even vaccinated dogs can still get sick, although vaccination significantly reduces the risk.
Right. The early signs of distemper can be subtle and easily mistaken for other illnesses.
So it's important to be aware of the potential symptoms and seek veterinary care immediately if you notice anything unusual in your dog.
Diagnosis can be challenging, but a combination of clinical signs, history, and lab tests can help veterinarians arrive at the right diagnosis.
And while there's no cure for distemper, supportive care can help manage the symptoms and give the dog's immune system a fighting chance.
Exactly. And the BAR study really highlighted the importance of following your veterinarian's recommendations for treatment and completing the full course of medication.
And perhaps most importantly, prevention is key. Vaccination is the most effective way to protect your dog from this devastating disease.
And this leads us to a really intriguing thought for our listeners. With the canine distemper virus constantly evolving, it begs the question, what does the future hold for vaccine development?
It's a valid question.
Could we one day have a universal distemper vaccine that's effective against all strains of the virus? Or could a better understanding of the virus's interaction with the immune system lead to the development of new, more effective treatments?
Fascinating questions for ongoing research, and really underscores how important it is to stay informed and to work closely with your veterinarian to protect your furry friend.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, if you have any concerns about canine distemper or your dog's health in general, please don't hesitate to reach out to your veterinarian. They're your best resource for information and guidance.
That's right. They're the experts. And thanks to our expert for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and insights.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.